for the second part of this activity, I wondered if teachers had the same number of pairs of shoes as students. So I asked my colleagues how many pairs of shoes they have, and here is their data. So what I want you to do is I want you to go to Staplet.com, and I want you to use the one quantitative variable multiple groups tab. Click it, put your data in there. You need to re-enter the student. And then I want you to make a dot plot. Look at the dot plots, the side-by-side stem plots, and the histogram, and then copy one of the graphs below, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so I chose to draw the histograms mainly because I don't like the side-by-side stem plots like that. And the dot plots, I feel we have enough experience with. So here I have my two histograms. I labeled them. I labeled who was students, who was teachers. I included my vertical scale. So, and I tried to line up my numbers top and bottom so I could have a better idea of how they relate to each other. So question 9 asks us to compare the distribution of the numbers of pairs of shoes for each student versus teachers. Be sure to address shape, outliers, center, and variability. All right, so shape. What do we notice about the shape? Okay, if you draw a loose curve, notice I'm not following each bin exactly. What do you notice? They're definitely not symmetrical. And you have the hump and then you have a tail. So remember, this is our whale. Wherever the tail is where the skew is. So we want to say for shape. All right, so for our shape, we can see that both distributions of the shoes owned are slightly skewed right. I went ahead and put this here. It could easily have gone into the outliers also. There are gaps in the data from 25 to 30 for the students, while the teachers have gaps at 0 to 5 and 25 to 35. So when we're talking about the shape, there's something called context. Context is what story is being told here. So we're talking about shoes owned. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that shoes owned was in there. That's some of our context. And the other thing is I want to make sure that I'm referring to teachers and students. I talked about both things because that's what our whole problem is about. So make sure you include the context of the problem. All right, the next part is outliers. Okay, for outliers, there are potential outliers for both distributions. 35 shoes owned for teachers and 37 and 41 shoes owned for students are potential outliers. Okay, so maybe you only mentioned the 41 instead of the 37 and the 41. That's fine. You're just looking at it and saying these are potential outliers. We don't actually know for sure. I included my context. I have shoes owned, and I talked about teachers, and I talked about students. So make sure you're answering what's being asked and including everybody in what you're trying to find out about. Okay, the next thing I want you to go ahead and try is center. See if you can answer this without listening to me first. All right, so the center, because our distributions are skewed to the right, wouldn't matter if it was skewed to the right or skewed to the left, the fact that they're skewed, I use the median to reference the middle. Okay, the median number of shoes owned, there's my context, in the student distribution, and I went ahead and put what the number was, 10, is lower, there's my comparison word, my ER word, than the median number of shoes owned in the teacher distribution, which is 12.5. Okay, so I talked about teachers, I talked about students, I used the numbers from the Staplet as my evidence for what I'm talking about. Finally, your spread, your variability, okay? Right now, we're talking about the range. So go ahead and see if you can talk about the variability of these two distributions and then check in to see how you did. All right, so for variability, I say the range of shoes owned by in the student distribution, 34, is greater than the range of shoes owned by the teachers, 29. So I've got shoes owned for context. I have my evidence numbers here. I talked about students and I talked about teachers, and I had an ER word right there, greater, to make a comparison. All right, to summarize what we've learned so far, We're going to talk about describing the distributions. I wanted to be sure you remembered the soft language, the LY words. When we talk about shape, we're only talking about 3 different shapes: skewed left, skewed right, and symmetrical. So our LY words, symmetrical, we like to use the word approximately a lot. Approximately, that's my LY word. And skewed left or skewed right, we could say slightly. You don't want to be very definitive, because if you're wrong, you could actually lose points for that. The second thing we want to be sure we talk about is outliers. So when you describe the outliers, you can mention gaps. In the example we did, I had put the gaps up with the shape. As long as you're talking about them, that's the really most important part. So you want to mention any gaps in the data and any potential outlier. We're going to learn a rule for determining if something is an outlier, but you can say something looks like an outlier without actually knowing. After outliers, we want to talk about the center. For the center, if we're talking about a symmetric distribution, we want to use the mean to refer to the center. But if the distribution is skewed left or right, we want to use the median to refer to the center because it's closer to the center. The mean gets pulled off a lot from the center by skewing. And finally, variability. How spread out is the data? You want to look at the range of the data, the biggest number minus the smallest number, your max and your min. Remember, if you're asked to compare, to use comparative words. And those would be the ER words, bigger, smaller, something along the line. So you're indicating how one distribution relates to the other distribution. All right, what I would like you to do is to finish the check your understanding, and that will be your assignment.
Yeah.